I was stationed in Nebraska in the late 80s. At the time, I hung out with my roommate and another friend. My name is Tracy. My roommate's name was also Tracy. And our third friend's name was Stacy. When we were together, everyone always thought we were lying, and being the silly teenagers we were, we always found it funny. One weekend, we decided to take a road trip to Kansas City, Missouri. We were speeding down the highway, laughing and singing at the top of our lungs. We were happy and having the time of our lives. Stacy was driving, and she had a bit of a lead foot. She must have been going too fast, because before long a state trooper pulled up behind us and turned on his lights. Stacy immediately pulled over. By the time the officer made it to her window, she already had her license and registration in hand and the window down. The officer looked at her, and then looked at me and Tracy. He then said, "I want you to follow me. Don't try to run off or y'all will be going to jail." He then turned, walked back to his car, and got into it. Needless to say, the three of us were puzzled, and spoke amongst ourselves to wonder why he didn't simply take Stacy's ID and write her a ticket. The officer pulled out slowly, and we dropped in behind him and followed him down the road. He drove a few miles, then exited the highway. He drove a little ways and turned onto a dirt road that was surrounded by tall stalks of corn. We all stopped speaking as we became more alarmed. However, we were young and scared, and since he was a police officer, we continued to follow him. The officer drove for some time down this dirt road and then pulled into an area that had a big beat-up old barn. As he parked and we stopped behind him, a group of men with shotguns exited the barn. It wasn't until that point did we realize we were in mortal danger and panic set in. The officer walked back to our car and told Stacy to get out and follow him to his car. As she got outside, she looked at me and Tracy with sheer terror on her face. She followed him to his car and he motioned for her to get into the passenger side. She did. Tracy and I were crying as the armed men stood outside of the car looking at us. We prayed that Stacy wasn't being hurt and somehow that they would let us leave. After some time, Stacy bolted out of the officer's car and ran back to our car and jumped into the driver's seat. She was crying hysterically, so of course, Tracy and I began to cry harder. The officer approached our car, this time going to Tracy's window in the front passenger seat. He asked, "Is it true y'all are in the Air Force?" To which Tracy replied, "Yes, sir." The officer calmly said, "Get out of here and go back to where y'all came from. I better not see y'all again." Stacy turned on the car, whipped it around, and sped back down the dirt road. She somehow navigated back to the highway. As we drove back toward the base, the silence was only broken by an occasional sob from one of us. Stacy drove for a while, and as soon as we crossed back over into Nebraska, she pulled over on the side of the highway and began to sob heavily. Tracy and I hugged her and asked if she was hurt in any way. She shook her head no. She wasn't hurt. After she calmed down enough, she told us what happened in the police car. After she got into the vehicle, she offered the police officer her ID and told him she was sorry for speeding. He took her information and then asked her, "What are you doing with those two?" Stacy was white. She explained that we were on a road trip. He then told her that if she would do certain favors for him, he might let us go with a warning. At that, Stacy had a complete meltdown. I guess while he was waiting for her to calm down, he finally looked at her ID and saw that she had given him a military ID. He asked her if we were all in the military, and between sobs, she said we were. He asked where we were stationed, and she told him, and he said to go back to her car. After Stacy told us what had occurred, I think it hit all three of us at the same time that the only thing that saved us was that we were in the military and stationed at a nearby base. We hugged each other and cried until we could not cry anymore. We didn't report what had happened. Again, We were teenagers and didn't think we would be believed over a law enforcement officer, and we never talked about it after that day. That incident has haunted me for years, all of the what-ifs. But as I have gotten older, what haunts me most is the thought that others may not have been as lucky as we were. This happened about 13 years ago, when I was a sophomore in college, attending a liberal arts school in New York. Within the first month or two of freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks, 6 guys, myself included, and 1 girl. And they all loved horror movies and ghost stories. I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would drive out to a creepy wooded spot in a nearby town for camping some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. We did some research and found that there was a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. Perfect. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off a busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you are almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads surrounded by trees. Very few streetlights and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So following the directions, we made a left off the main road, driving for 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting intentionally lost. Our cars made a turn and, to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees beyond it. We all got out to see what exactly it was, stepping over the log, and noticed 2 narrow trails leading in separate directions. This seemed like as good a time as any to grab our flashlights and do some amateur ghost hunting. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went in, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the feeling we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. And in any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared. Not to mention the fact that we were 7 able-bodied college students. What would we come across that could take us down? We followed the trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing. And I mean massive. It was a large open field of unkempt grass, comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. Trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large we could not see the end of it from where we were standing. I was thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of my friends pointed to the right, where there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. It was completely dark, with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, the windows and doors were all boarded up. I peered between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live there was long gone. Because there was no way in, and because we all felt sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we decided to walk closer to the trail where we had come from, have a seat in the field, and figure out what to do next. We walked towards that narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he pointed. We all turned, and on a very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. And by dancing, I mean skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same to another tree, like a do-si-do. The moon was so bright and the woods so dark, it actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the 6'4" skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him, pointed in that direction, and said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see that?" He squinted a bit, and the second he saw it, he gasped with everything he had, clutched my arm, and whispered, "What the hell is that?" What happened next sent shockwaves through all of us. Whoever it was, they stopped dancing, looked in our direction, and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked and ran back to the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our cars, hopped in, and were peeling away in closer to 5. Once we were a safe distance away, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what had just happened. My heart was pounding, and I know everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we are all still friends, living in different states but keeping in touch through marriages, divorces, children, etc. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the others with something to the effect of, "The woods. That really happened, right?" And it most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind, and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever that was, they were dancing maniacally in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Did he know we were there from the second we parked? Was he the sound that I kept hearing when we walked the trail? Whatever the case may be, when he came for us that night, you can be sure none of us wanted to stick around and see what he was truly capable of. I love road trips. There's nothing like the freedom of exploring the world by yourself. I was on an assignment for the Army, making my way up from San Antonio, Texas, to Tacoma, Washington. It was a long drive, and they gave me 6 days to report to my new unit. The first day of my journey, I planned to get as much driving in as possible so I could spend a few days in Utah, a sort of mini vacation, you could say. This was January, and the days were short, so maximizing the amount of daylight I had was crucial. I got up extra early that morning, carried the last of my bags out to my Corolla, signed out of my old unit, and hit the road at roughly 5 a.m. It was an amazing day. I saw the landscape transform around me as I headed farther west than I had ever been in my life. From the San Antonio metropolitan area to the savannas of the Edwards Plateau, to the pancake flat farmland of the Great Plains region, America's breadbasket. Finally, the farms opened up into prairie, and I saw the "Welcome to New Mexico, the Land of Enchantment" sign. Now, I was really in the middle of nowhere. Continuing on US Route 380, I eventually found myself in Roswell. I could have gotten a few more hours of driving in to make it to Albuquerque, but I figured since I was in no rush, I might as well see what Roswell had to offer. Who knows if I would get a chance to visit again? As a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, I took a self-guided tour of the shops and attractions. The next day, I continued to Albuquerque, then westward on Interstate 40. By the time I reached Gallup and started northbound on US Route 491, I still had 2 hours of driving left before crossing into Colorado, and another 45 minutes before I would get to Cortez, where I planned to stop for the night. However, the daylight was already running out, as sunset was at 6 p.m. I got a coffee and refreshed myself for the final stretch. It was supposed to be easy, just a straight shot. But looking back now, I figured that had I decided to stop in Albuquerque instead of Roswell the previous night, I would have already been in Colorado by now, possibly making my way into Utah. I could have saved myself from what was waiting for me on that desolate highway. Route 491 stretched far into the Navajo Nation. On either side of me were endless expanses of prairie bookended by dark indigo mountains on the horizon. To my left, the sky glowed a faint orange-purple, the light slowly dying down like smoldering embers in a fire, until finally plunging the land into darkness. Every now and then, I would see the forlorn headlights of another car passing by, which gave me a bit of relief that I wasn't completely alone. I also had my road trip playlist on to keep me company, and call me ironic, but Hotel California was playing. After passing the small, lonely town of Newcomb, the next piece of civilization would be Shiprock. However, between the two was a 36-mile stretch of absolute nothingness, an abyss I would have to cross, and I was not ready for what I was about to witness. After several miles and having not seen another car on the road, I saw something strange emerge from the horizon. Barely lit by moonlight, I thought it was a road sign at first. Then, as I came closer, I realized it was a person walking on the shoulder of the road in my direction. I squinted, trying my hardest to focus on the figure. In the darkness, I could tell they were wearing a poncho of some sort, with long black hair flowing down past their chest. Who could be walking out here all alone at night, I thought. Whoever it was, they had no lights, no reflectors, no strobes of any kind to signal to passing cars that they were there, and they walked on the pavement, dangerously close to oncoming traffic. I pulled to the left a bit to give them more room. Suddenly, my stereo cut out as if I had turned it off. The screen went completely dark and my phone disconnected from Bluetooth. While this was unusual, it certainly did happen from time to time, so I thought nothing of it. As I approached, I saw the person raise their right arm as if to flag me down and hitch a ride. Oh, no, I thought. There's no way that's happening, buddy. As my headlights swept by, I realized it was a man, dressed in a button-up shirt, a wool poncho, jeans, and cowboy boots. His large belt buckle glinted as the lights passed him. But in that split second, I realized with abject shock that not only were his eyes painfully wide open, but they seemed to be tracking me. Somehow, he was able to see me through the glare of my headlights and look me dead in the eyes, not breaking contact until I had passed. I was shaken for a bit, but my nerves gradually subsided. My stereo abruptly turned back on, and my music continued playing. I looked in the rearview mirror. He was gone. I couldn't see him. Maybe he's too far behind me already, I thought. No, that couldn't be. It must just be too dark. I drove on, trying to figure out what had just happened, but at the same time forcing myself not to think about it. I brushed everything off as simply my imagination, the darkness and the shadows playing tricks on my mind. Just when I thought I had moved on, I saw another shape in the distance. Another person walking alone at night? There's no way. They walked along the shoulder of the road, swaying back and forth. Slowly, I could make out that this person was also wearing a poncho. Then I saw what looked like long black hair reaching down past the chest. It was the same man, but how? He raised his arm again, trying to flag me down. I kept up my pace with no intention of stopping for any reason. And just like last time, my stereo turned off. Suddenly, the man leapt out onto the road, arms waving frantically. I swerved into the left lane, narrowly avoiding him. In my headlights, I noticed he had the same wide-eyed look, his gaze locked onto mine. I also saw that his clothes did not look as they did the first encounter. Once they were clean, if not well worn, but now they were soiled and tattered, rags barely hanging onto his withered frame. His hair was wild and unkempt, with clods of dried dirt stuck in the locks, but his eyes remained the same. My heart nearly burst through my chest at the sudden shock. Hyperventilating, I slowed down and glanced into the rearview mirror to make sure he was all right. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to see. The man was running. He was sprinting towards me. I centered the wheel and accelerated, hoping to get as much distance from him as possible. But as I continued to speed up, so did he. Faster and faster I drove, but every time I looked in the mirror, I would still see him right behind me, perfectly keeping pace, his body tinted red by my taillights. I could feel my temples throbbing and my hands getting slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I was sick to my stomach. There's no way, I thought. I looked forward, hoping to see a faint glimmer of light from the town ahead, but I was still too far away. I looked back in the rear view. The man was gone. I should have been relieved, but I knew better. I looked around, hoping to regain a visual on him, but I couldn't see anything. I took a deep breath and refocused on the road with my guard still up. Just keep driving, I told myself. Only a few more miles to go. Then, out of the corner of my right eye, I saw something. Another shape. It looked like some kind of animal, though I couldn't make out exactly what it was. Under the moonlight, I could see it running alongside my car, its forelimbs reaching out in long strides, its back undulating like a dog. Closer and closer it came. The closer it was, the more of it I could see, little by little. And I noticed its limbs were far too long for its body. It had no tail. The head was oddly round, and from it came a trail of long, black hair. I slammed my foot on the gas, pushing my car's engine harder than it had ever been pushed before. By now I was clocking well over 110 miles per hour, but this creature, it kept up. It wasn't phased. It simply ran faster and faster to match my speed. Just what was this thing? How could anyone or anything run this fast? Soon my car would hit the top speed. And then what? How long could it maintain that before breaking down? It wouldn't be long before the engine overheats. But regardless, I would eventually run out of gas. And when I do, what would happen if that thing got me? At 120 miles per hour, my car had reached its limit. This was the fastest I could go, but the creature continued its pursuit. My temperature gauge was approaching the red, and it wouldn't be long until the engine overheated. Suddenly, like the beacon of a lighthouse on a stormy sea, the first light of town came into view. It was close. If I could just go a little longer, I could make it to safety. I pressed on. I fixed my eyes on the lights growing brighter on the horizon. They bloomed outwards, glimmering in the night air. Though it was a small town, it was a sight for sore eyes. Looking in my periphery, I saw the undulation of the creature's spine as it kept pace with my car. But now, it was starting to slip away, steering farther and farther from the road. It suddenly hit me just how hard my heart was beating. Beads of sweat dripped down my face. And finally, the creature was gone. My stereo once again turned back on, and as my music resumed, I let off the accelerator, breathing a deep sigh of relief. That man, that creature, whatever it was finally gone for good. Having white-knuckled the steering wheel the whole time without realizing it, my hands were extremely sore, but I was glad to have made it through. A week later, I told another soldier in my unit about what I had experienced. Being originally from Albuquerque, she was familiar with the Native American legends of the Southwest. The conversation steered towards a certain creature that she would not dare speak the name of. She also told me that the highway I took was well known for all sorts of paranormal phenomena. Up until 2003, Route 491 had been called U.S. Route 666, the Devil's Highway. My Aunt Kay was in her early 20s in the 1980s. This was before she married my uncle, when she would drive long distances back and forth between her parents and my uncles to visit. It was a transitional period for them. He had just graduated, and she hadn't moved out yet to be with him. It was a long drive across several states, through the desert, which took her hours. This desolate highway would have stretches of road that lasted hundreds of miles, where you quite often wouldn't see another driver, let alone a gas station. So Aunt Kay set out and began one of those journeys. A couple hours into the drive, she noticed a dark vehicle slowly catching up to her. She barely noticed as she continued to sing along to the Les Mis soundtrack until the vehicle got aggressively close. She turned off the music and looked into her rearview mirror, seeing the vehicle flash its brights and a hand pointing at her car and motioning for her to pull over. Alarmed, she quickly slowed down and began to look for a good place to pull off the road and see what must be wrong with her car. The second she began to pull off the road, she heard, as clear as day, a voice say,
"Don't pull over."
Then again,
"Don't pull over."
Whether it was a guardian angel or just a gut feeling, a jolt of adrenaline and fear shot through her body as she hit the gas and peeled back out onto the highway. Heart pumping, Aunt Kay silently asked herself what the hell was that, as she saw the vehicle peel out behind her. The dark vehicle continued to closely follow, flashing their brights and motioning for her to pull over. Fear and confusion overwhelmed her as Aunt Kay began to question what was going on. Why was the driver motioning for her to pull over? Was there something wrong with her car? And what the hell was that warning she felt or heard? This was before cell phones, and it would have been a severe situation if her car broke down out there, but she had no choice but to press on. Just as her resolve wavered, the dark vehicle picked up speed. It entered the oncoming traffic lane and came level with my aunt's car. The driver smiled, pointed, motioned, and mouthed the words, "Pull over," to my aunt. She said the second she looked into his eyes, she felt pure evil. She felt a horribly sick feeling in the pit of her stomach and again heard the words in her head,
"Don't pull over."
She described him as looking scary and greasy, with a smile that she'll never forget. It sent chills through her. This quickly dispelled any thoughts she had of pulling over, and she put the pedal to the metal to try to lose him. He chased after her. When she slowed down, he slowed down. If she sped up, he did too. It got to the point that he began to try to push her car off the road. Aunt Kay was at the point of tears as this creep continued to terrorize her out in the middle of nowhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she saw a couple of semi-trucks off in the distance. She felt that if she could get closer to them, or even between those trucks, she would be safe. So she took off. He continued flashing his lights, honking his horn and trying to hit her car until she was close enough to the trucks. As she got in between them, she saw the dark vehicle slow way down, eventually disappearing from view. She stayed with those trucks for a couple hours until she felt safe enough to pull over at a gas station and cry. Many years later, my aunt and uncle are married. He's working at a law firm as a high-profile criminal prosecutor in Las Vegas. She's now a full-time mom of several young children. Since I've known my aunt, she's been obsessed with true crime. Dateline, 2020, Unsolved Mysteries, they're always playing at her house. This day was no different. She was folding laundry in the kitchen while listening to the TV in the other room. The interviewer was talking about a man who was being interviewed on death row. As she paired another match of socks, she heard the man describe one of his tactics for procuring victims. According to him, he would wait along the side of the highway. When a car would go by with a family, he'd wait. Another car with a male driver would go by, and he'd wait. But every so often, a car would go by with a pretty young woman driving alone. So he'd pull out and follow them, flashing his brights, honking and motioning for him to pull over. Aunt Kay, paralyzed, continued to listen. When they would eventually pull over, he would tell them there was something wrong with the car, telling them to pop the hood so he could help them. When they did, he'd yank out a few wires, disabling the car. "No problem," he'd say. "My buddy has a shop in the next town. I'll give you a ride, and he'll give you a good deal." My aunt slowly moved to the living room, and when they'd get in his car, he'd have his way with them, and then dispose of them somewhere in the desert. When they asked how many times he did this, he responded, "Too many times to count. They'll never find all the bodies." Then they asked if anybody ever got away. The man paused and said, "2 or 3. My aunt stood alone, staring into the same toothless grin she saw on that highway that day. It was the face of Henry Lee Lucas, also known as the Confession Killer.